The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Donna's diner like broken promises. Evelyn Martinez wiped down the same counter for the third time, her movements automatic, mechanical. She had been invisible for so long that sometimes she wondered if she truly existed at all. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're serving tables, polishing glasses, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. The aroma of burnt coffee mixed with the heavy scent of bacon grease, creating a symphony of working-class Chicago that most people in the gleaming towers above never noticed. Evelyn moved between the red vinyl booths like a ghost in a faded uniform, her name tag slightly crooked. Her shoes worn thin from years of carrying other people's meals and absorbing their careless words. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look tired, but none more so than the woman who had been serving the same breakfast specials for 7 years. In the distance, through the steamed windows, the Willis Tower pierced the sky like a silver needle, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun in brilliant flashes. Inside those heights, men in $1,000 suits made decisions that moved millions of dollars with the casual ease of ordering toast. Maxwell Grant was one of those men, a 42-year-old billionaire whose investment portfolio included everything from tech startups to cryptocurrency mining operations. His net worth fluctuated by more than most people earned in a lifetime, yet he had never once considered the woman who poured his coffee when he occasionally slummed it at street-level diners for what he called authentic experiences. Evelyn's hands were stained with years of service, small cuts from broken plates that had healed into tiny white scars. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, gray threads beginning to show at her temples like silver wire. She was 43 years old, and had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders since her husband died in a construction accident 8 years ago, leaving her with a 6-year-old son and medical bills that consumed her dreams. The diner's bell chimed as another customer entered, bringing with them a gust of cold October air that carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Evelyn looked up from her order pad, her brown eyes holding depths of intelligence that no one bothered to explore. She had learned to make herself smaller, to speak softer, to anticipate needs before they were voiced. The art of invisibility was her survival skill, perfected through necessity and sharpened by disappointment. Behind the counter, the ancient cash register wheezed and groaned with each transaction. The coffee machine hissed like an angry cat, and somewhere in the kitchen, plates clattered against the steel sink in an endless percussion of service. This was Evelyn's world, measured in tips counted by quarters and the ache in her feet at the end of 14-hour shifts. Yet, in the margins of her receipt book, in the quiet moments between orders, she wrote numbers that told different stories. Market trends she noticed from overheard conversations, investment strategies she understood better than the men who discussed them over Eggs Benedict, patterns in the economy that she could read like weather signs. The truth was that Evelyn Martinez possessed a mind for business that would have made her a fortune on Wall Street, but life had dealt her a different hand. She watched the stock market on her phone during breaks, read financial newspapers left behind by customers, and understood the intricate dance of capital and commerce with an intuition that came from watching money flow past her like water while she stood perpetually thirsty. Her worn notebook, hidden beneath her apron, contained insights that could have saved companies or launched startups. But in Donna's diner, she was just the waitress who remembered how you liked your coffee. The morning rush began to build. Office workers grabbing quick breakfasts before disappearing into the tower elevators that would carry them to their air-conditioned offices and conference rooms. They spoke of their weekend plans, their stock options, their bonuses, their investment gains. Evelyn served them silently, efficiently, absorbing their casual mentions of Bitcoin portfolios and real estate investments, while calculating in her head that their weekend spending money often exceeded her monthly rent. She had become an expert at reading people, understanding their desires and fears through the way they held their coffee cups and counted their change. In her small apartment in Pilsen, 12-year-old Miguel waited for her each evening, homework spread across their second-hand kitchen table. He was brilliant like his mother, curious about everything, asking questions about business and money that she answered carefully, teaching him to see patterns and opportunities even as she struggled to create them for herself. The boy dreamed of college, of possibilities beyond their neighborhood, and Evelyn worked double shifts to keep those dreams alive, even as her own seemed to fade with each passing year. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm. Michigan Avenue filled with shoppers carrying bags from stores where a single scarf could cost more than Evelyn earned in a week. The Chicago River reflected the morning light, and somewhere in those reflected towers, Maxwell Grant was about to make a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. The wealthy moved through their days insulated by money and privilege, while people like Evelyn navigated the spaces between, holding up the infrastructure of service that made their comfort possible. As the morning stretched toward noon, Evelyn wiped down tables that had seen thousands of meals, conversations, and small human dramas. Her uniform was pressed despite being years old, her appearance neat despite the chaos around her. She maintained her dignity like a carefully tended flame, never letting the daily humiliations extinguish the quiet pride she carried in doing her work well. The bell above the door chimed again, and another customer entered, scanning the room with the entitled gaze of someone accustomed to being served. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, picked up her order pad, and prepared to become invisible once more. Not knowing that her life was about to collide with forces beyond her control, and that her quiet intelligence was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. Evelyn's day began at 4:30 each morning in her cramped apartment on 18th Street, where the rumble of the Blue Line provided a steady bass note to her daily routine. She would rise in darkness, careful not to wake Miguel, who slept on the pull-out couch in their one-bedroom space, his textbooks stacked neatly beside his pillow like building blocks of ambition. The apartment smelled of last night's dinner, rice and beans stretched with hope and seasoning, and the faint mustiness of old radiators that clanked and sighed throughout the winter months. Her morning ritual was precise, born from necessity and perfected by repetition. Coffee from a dented aluminum pot, black because milk was a luxury saved for Miguel's cereal. She would study her reflection in the bathroom mirror, noting the new lines around her eyes, the deepening hollow beneath her cheekbones, the way her uniform hung looser on her frame despite her efforts to maintain weight. The woman looking back at her carried stories in every line, sacrifices that had carved themselves into her features like topographic maps of endurance. The walk to Donna's Diner took 22 minutes through neighborhoods where languages mixed like ingredients in a complex dish. Spanish from the panaderias, Polish from the old-timers gathering at corner stores, English with accents from Mississippi and Alabama carried north by families chasing factory jobs that had long since disappeared. Evelyn knew these streets intimately, could navigate them in any weather, understood the rhythm of her community in ways that the downtown business district never would. At the diner, she tied her apron with practiced movements, checking her pockets for pens, order pads, and the small notebook where she recorded more than just customer preferences. Her handwriting filled margins with observations about market trends, notes about conversations overheard from the financial district workers who frequented the breakfast rush. She understood compound interest better than most investment advisors, could calculate profit margins in her head while balancing plates on her arm, yet her knowledge remained trapped in a world that valued her hands, but never her mind. Her co-workers at Donna's were women like herself, survivors who had learned to find dignity in service, who protected each other with small kindnesses and shared understanding. Rosa, the cook, who sent money to family in Michoacan while raising 3 children alone. Janet, the other waitress, whose husband's disability check barely covered their medications. They formed an unofficial sisterhood of endurance, sharing tips when someone's child was sick, covering shifts when life exploded in the unexpected ways it always did, for people with no financial cushion to absorb the impact. The customers flowed through the diner in predictable waves. Construction workers before dawn, coffee black and strong, plates of eggs and hash browns consumed quietly before heading to job sites. Office workers during morning rush, stressed and distracted, phones pressed to ears while they ordered lattes and pastries to go. Businessmen during lunch, discussing deals and market fluctuations while she refilled their water glasses and remained invisible to their strategic conversations. Evelyn had become an expert at reading the hierarchy in their voices, understanding which men held real power and which ones were merely performing importance for their colleagues. She knew that the quiet ones often controlled the most assets, that true wealth spoke softer than insecurity. Her observations filled her notebook with insights about leadership styles, investment strategies, and the psychology of financial decision-making that she would never have the opportunity to apply in any official capacity. Between shifts, she would sit in the back booth with financial newspapers left behind by customers, studying market reports and company analyses with the concentration of a graduate student. She understood that Maxwell Grant's conglomerate was overextended in certain sectors, could see the vulnerabilities in their diversification strategy that the financial press seemed to miss. Her mind processed complex economic relationships with an intuition that came from understanding resource scarcity at its most fundamental level. The constant pressure of financial stress wore on her like water on stone. Rent was due in 3 days, and she was $40 short despite working 6 days a week. Miguel needed new shoes for school, but that would have to wait until her next tip cycle improved. Every decision was a calculation of competing necessities, every purchase weighed against future consequences. She had become a master of financial triage, understanding how to stretch resources in ways that people with unlimited capital could never comprehend. Her dreams had not died so much as evolved, transforming from personal ambition into fierce determination for her son's future. She saved every spare dollar in a coffee can beneath their kitchen sink, $5 and $10 bills accumulated through extraordinary sacrifice, building toward Miguel's college fund with the methodical patience of someone who understood that compound interest worked for small amounts too, given enough time and discipline. The afternoon light would slant through the diner windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above worn formica tables where generations of working people had shared meals and stories. Evelyn moved through this light like a figure in a painting, carrying coffee pots and conversation, absorbing the casual cruelties of customers who saw her uniform but never her face, who showed appreciation through tips but never recognition of her intelligence or dignity. As evening approached and her double shift neared its end, she would count her tips in the tiny office behind the kitchen, calculating how much would go to rent, utilities, groceries, Miguel's school supplies. The mathematics of survival required precision that no business school curriculum could teach, an understanding of risk and return measured not in percentage points, but in her child's nutrition and opportunities. The L train would carry her home through neighborhoods where gentrification crept like slow tide, displacing families who had built communities over generations. She watched the city change through train windows, understanding better than most economists how capital flows reshaped entire communities, how investment decisions made in distant boardrooms determined which schools would close and which rent prices would rise beyond working families' reach. By the time she reached home, Miguel would be finishing homework at their small table, his questions about mathematics and science revealing an intellect that reminded her daily of everything she was working toward. She would help him with assignments while preparing their simple dinner, explaining complex concepts with the clarity of someone who understood learning from multiple angles, who had never stopped studying despite having no classroom or professor to guide her. The night would settle over their apartment like a familiar blanket, and Evelyn would sit beside Miguel's sleeping form, her notebook open under the single lamp, writing observations and insights that would never be valued in any marketplace, calculating probabilities and strategies that would never be implemented by any corporation. Yet, she continued to learn and analyze and hope, understanding somehow that knowledge was its own form of wealth, and that wisdom earned through struggle held value that could never be measured in dollars or Bitcoin or any other currency that moved through the towers above her forgotten diner. The humiliation came on a Tuesday morning when the autumn rain had turned Chicago's streets into mirrors, reflecting the harsh fluorescent light of corporate ambition. Maxwell Grant entered Donna's diner like storm weather, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the downpour, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the checkered linoleum with the sharp precision of a man accustomed to commanding attention. The diner fell into a subtle hush, not because anyone recognized him, but because wealth carries its own gravitational field, pulling the oxygen from rooms and demanding deference without explanation. Evelyn was balancing 4 plates along her left arm when she first saw him, coffee pot in her right hand, navigating between tables with the fluid grace of someone who had perfected the dance of service through years of necessity. He had chosen the corner booth, the one beneath the flickering neon sign advertising Coca-Cola, its pink light casting shadows that made his already severe expression appear almost sinister. His phone was pressed to his ear, and even from across the room, she could hear the edge in his voice as he discussed quarterly projections and market volatility with the casual ruthlessness of someone for whom millions of dollars were merely numbers on quarterly reports. She approached his table with the practiced neutrality she had perfected, order pad ready, pen poised above paper that had absorbed thousands of similar transactions. Maxwell Grant looked up at her with the same expression he might reserve for examining financial statements, analytical, distant, completely devoid of recognition that he was looking at another human being rather than a functionary designed to facilitate his comfort. "Coffee," he said without preamble, returning his attention to his phone call. "Black, hot, and make sure the cup is clean this time. I was at a place on LaSalle yesterday where the waitress brought me a cup with lipstick marks. Disgusting. You people need to understand that cleanliness is basic professionalism." The casual cruelty of "you people" hit Evelyn like a physical blow, but her expression remained neutral, professional. She had heard variations of this dismissal countless times, understood that to men like Maxwell Grant, service workers existed in a different category of humanity, perpetually suspect of incompetence or moral failing. She poured his coffee with steady hands, noting the way he continued his phone conversation as if she were invisible, discussing Bitcoin investments and cryptocurrency portfolios while she stood beside his table like furniture. "The Jakarta deal needs to close by Friday," he was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who moved global capital with casual commands. "I don't care if their infrastructure isn't ready. We'll force their hand through the Shanghai subsidiary. Sometimes you have to remind these people who controls the real money." Evelyn set his coffee down carefully, noting that his watch cost more than she would earn in 2 years, that his business discussion involved amounts that could have funded her son's entire college education with money left over for graduate school. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her with the sharp authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Excuse me," he said, not looking up from his phone. "This coffee tastes like it was made with dirty water. Are you people even trying? Or is this the kind of service I should expect in a place like this?" The diner's morning conversations seemed to pause, other customers glancing over with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something unpleasant. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the slow burn of anger that she had learned to compress into professional composure. She had prepared that coffee herself, using the same careful technique that had satisfied thousands of customers, but she understood that Maxwell Grant's complaint had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with establishing hierarchy. "I can bring you a fresh cup," she offered quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. "Perhaps you'd prefer it prepared differently?" Maxwell Grant finally looked directly at her, his gray eyes cold as winter lake water. "What I would prefer is service that meets basic standards. Do Do you understand what standards are? Or is that concept too complex for someone in your position? The words landed like physical slaps, each syllable calculated to diminish and dismiss. Around them, the diner's atmosphere grew thick with uncomfortable tension, other customers focusing intently on their own meals while witnessing Evelyn's public degradation. She felt the familiar sensation of becoming smaller, of shrinking into the apologetic posture that survival required when confronted with casual cruelty from those who held economic power over her existence. "I understand standards very well, sir," she replied, her voice carrying just the faintest edge of something that made Maxwell pause in his phone conversation. "I'll bring you fresh coffee immediately." But as she turned away, she heard him speaking to whoever was on the other end of his call, his voice deliberately loud enough for her and the surrounding tables to hear clearly. "I'm sitting in some diner in the Loop where they hire people who can barely manage basic tasks. It's exactly the kind of workforce problem we've been discussing. No education, no skills, no understanding of quality or efficiency. These people wonder why they're stuck in minimum wage jobs when they can't even pour coffee correctly." The humiliation was designed to be public, calculated to reinforce his superiority while reducing her to a cautionary tale about class and competence. Evelyn felt every eye in the diner upon her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about her response. She carried the coffee pot back to the kitchen with measured steps, her composure intact, but her dignity burning like acid in her throat. In the kitchen's harsh fluorescent light, Rosa looked up from the grill with knowing eyes that had witnessed similar scenes countless times. "You okay, mija?" she asked quietly, her spatula pausing above sizzling hash browns. Evelyn nodded, preparing fresh coffee with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She understood that Maxwell Grant's cruelty was not personal, but systemic, part of a worldview that required service workers to absorb humiliation as part of their job description. Yet, understanding did not diminish the sting of being publicly reduced to a stereotype, of having her intelligence and dignity dismissed by someone who had never faced the complex calculus of working poverty. When she returned to his table with fresh coffee, Maxwell Grant was deep in conversation about market manipulation strategies, his voice carrying across the diner as he discussed moving capital through offshore accounts to avoid regulatory oversight. Evelyn set down the new cup without comment, but as she turned to leave, her notebook slipped from her apron pocket, falling open to reveal pages of financial analysis and market predictions written in her careful handwriting. Maxwell glanced down dismissively, then did a double-take as his eyes focused on the complex equations and market projections covering the page. For just a moment, his expression shifted from contempt to confusion, as if he were seeing something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about who possessed financial intelligence. But the moment passed quickly, and he returned to his phone call without comment, leaving Evelyn to retrieve her notebook and return to her invisible service, carrying his casual cruelty like another weight in her collection of daily indignities. The turning point arrived with the subtle violence of a hairline crack, becoming a structural failure, invisible until the moment when everything changed irrevocably. It was 3 weeks after Maxwell Grant's public humiliation of Evelyn, and the autumn had deepened into the kind of Chicago cold that penetrated wool coats and settled in bones like an unwelcome inheritance. The diner's atmosphere had grown tense as rumors spread through the service industry network that several downtown restaurants were facing sudden closures, victims of a larger economic restructuring that moved through working-class neighborhoods like a silent plague. Evelyn was wiping down the counter when she overheard a conversation that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. 2 men in expensive suits had chosen the back booth, their voices low, but not quite low enough for someone with Evelyn's trained ear for picking up fragments of important information. They were discussing Maxwell Grant's latest acquisition, a chain of family restaurants that his investment group had purchased through what they called strategic foreclosure opportunities, buying up properties from families who could no longer afford rising commercial rents. "Grant doesn't understand the service industry," one of them was saying, his voice carrying the casual authority of insider knowledge. He thinks you can run restaurants like tech companies, eliminate the human element, maximize profit margins through automation, and reduce labor costs. It's going to be a disaster. Evelyn continued cleaning, her movements automatic, while her mind processed the implications. She understood better than most the delicate ecosystem that made restaurants successful, knew that service was not merely about delivering food, but about creating spaces where community could flourish. Maxwell Grant's approach would destroy the very relationships that sustained these businesses, replacing experienced workers with cost-cutting measures that would ultimately alienate the customers they were meant to serve. During her break, she sat in the back booth with her notebook, writing with the focused intensity of someone who had finally found a way to channel years of accumulated observation into actionable insight. Her analysis was comprehensive, detailing why Maxwell's acquisition strategy would fail and what alternative approaches might succeed. She understood the psychology of repeat customers, the economics of staff retention, the cultural factors that made neighborhood restaurants into community anchors rather than mere profit centers. The mathematical models she developed were sophisticated, accounting for variables that traditional business analysis often ignored. The value of experienced servers who remembered customer preferences, the loyalty generated by consistent food quality, the social capital created by restaurants that became neighborhood gathering places. Her projections showed clearly why Maxwell's cost-cutting approach would reduce short-term expenses while destroying long-term viability. But Evelyn also understood that her insights, no matter how accurate, would never reach the decision-makers who needed to hear them. She was trapped by the same economic structures she was analyzing, unable to translate her knowledge into influence, because influence required the kind of credibility that came with advanced degrees and corporate positions, neither of which were available to women who spent their days serving coffee and absorbing public humiliation. The cruel irony was not lost on her. She possessed exactly the expertise that Maxwell Grant's investment group needed to avoid catastrophic mistakes. Yet the class barriers that his own wealth helped maintain ensured that her knowledge would remain invisible and unused. She was like a doctor forced to watch patients die while being dismissed as unqualified to offer treatment, her insights rendered worthless by prejudices that confused education with intelligence, credentials with competence. That evening, as she rode the L home through neighborhoods where gentrification was displacing families who had built communities over generations, Evelyn made a decision that surprised her with its audacity. She would find a way to deliver her analysis to Maxwell Grant, not from a position of humility, but from one of professional competence. If he was determined to destroy businesses through ignorance, she would at least give him the opportunity to make informed decisions, even if those decisions ultimately affected her own employment. She spent the next week refining her analysis, creating a comprehensive report that detailed both the flaws in his current strategy and alternative approaches that could generate sustainable profits while maintaining the community relationships that made restaurants successful. Her writing was clear and precise, her data impeccable, her recommendations grounded in deep understanding of both financial principles and human psychology. The challenge was delivery. She could not simply approach Maxwell Grant at the diner. Their previous encounter had established a dynamic of contempt that would prevent him from taking her seriously. She needed a context where her expertise could be evaluated on its own merits, separate from the prejudices that his wealth and her uniform evoked. Opportunity presented itself through Janet, her fellow waitress, whose sister worked as a receptionist at one of the downtown office buildings. Through a series of careful conversations and small favors, Evelyn arranged to have her analysis delivered to Maxwell Grant's office as an anonymous consultant's report, with no identifying information that would reveal its true author. She typed her final version on Miguel's laptop late at night, formatting the document to match the professional standards she had observed in business papers left behind by customers. Her language was formal but accessible, her arguments logical and supported by detailed financial projections. The report was 23 pages of insights that could have saved Maxwell Grant's investment group millions of dollars and preserved hundreds of jobs, written by a woman whose intelligence had been dismissed as irrelevant to the very problems she was solving. As she sealed the envelope that would carry her analysis into the gleaming towers of finance, Evelyn felt something she had not experienced in years, the pride of intellectual work valued for its own merit rather than its service to others' comfort. For once, her mind would speak before her uniform, her ideas would be heard before her social position was assessed. She was stepping across class boundaries with nothing but knowledge as her passport, gambling that competence could overcome prejudice if delivered in the right package. The envelope disappeared into the corporate mail system like a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of indifference, carrying Evelyn's insights toward shores where such knowledge was valued in direct proportion to its potential for generating profit. Whether Maxwell Grant would recognize the wisdom in her words, whether he would understand that the waitress he had humiliated possessed exactly the expertise his business needed, these questions hung in the Chicago air like winter promises, uncertain but necessary, demanding answers that only time would provide. The downfall began with the subtle violence of economic forces moving like weather across the landscape of working-class Chicago, invisible until they destroyed everything in their path. Maxwell Grant's acquisition of the restaurant chain proceeded exactly as Evelyn had predicted in her anonymous analysis, with cost-cutting measures that stripped experienced staff and replaced them with minimum wage workers who had neither the skills nor the investment necessary to maintain customer relationships. Within 2 months, 3 of the acquired restaurants had closed permanently, their loyal customer bases scattered to competitors who understood that service was more than mere food delivery. The anonymous report that Evelyn had so carefully crafted had indeed reached Maxwell Grant's desk, but it had been filed away without serious consideration, dismissed by his executive team as the work of some academic who understood theory but not practical business realities. The irony was devastating. The very insights that could have prevented his losses were ignored because they came without the proper institutional credibility, while the advice he did follow, from consultants with impressive degrees and corporate pedigrees, led him directly toward the disasters that Evelyn had mathematically predicted. At Donna's Diner, the consequences of these larger economic movements began to manifest in smaller, more personal ways. Foot traffic decreased as neighborhood gentrification displaced long-term customers, while rising commercial rents pressured the diner's profit margins beyond sustainability. Evelyn watched these changes with the helpless clarity of someone who understood systematic problems, but lacked the power to address them, like a meteorologist watching a hurricane approach while being unable to warn the people in its path. The end came on a Thursday morning in November, when Donna herself, now in her 70s and facing medical bills that exceeded her insurance coverage, announced that she would be selling the diner to a corporate food service company that specialized in converting independent restaurants into franchise operations. The new owners would renovate completely, install automated ordering systems, and staff the restaurant with part-time workers who could be easily replaced and required minimal training. Evelyn absorbed this news with the numb shock of someone who had survived countless economic catastrophes, understanding immediately that her years of accumulated knowledge about customers, suppliers, and operational efficiency would be discarded as irrelevant to the new business model. The corporate efficiency experts who had redesigned the operation had never worked a double shift or calculated tips to determine whether rent could be paid on time, but they possessed the kind of credentials that qualified them to eliminate jobs held by people like her. Her final shift at Donna's Diner carried the weight of an ending that felt both inevitable and deeply unjust. She moved through familiar routines with the mechanical precision of muscle memory, serving regular customers who would soon find their neighborhood gathering place transformed into something optimized for profit rather than community. The conversations she had overheard for years, the relationships she had built through careful attention to preferences and personal details, the informal counseling she had provided to customers facing their own economic struggles. All of this social capital would be destroyed in the name of operational efficiency. The corporate transition team arrived during the afternoon shift, young men and women in business casual clothes who measured counter space and analyzed customer flow patterns with the clinical detachment of surgeons examining diseased tissue. They spoke in the specialized vocabulary of management consulting, discussing customer touchpoints and service optimization, while completely missing the human relationships that had sustained the diner through decades of neighborhood change. Evelyn found herself explaining the diner's operations to these efficiency experts, detailing supplier relationships and customer preferences with the patience of someone teaching children about adult realities. Yet, even as they took notes on her insights, she could see in their expressions the assumption that her knowledge was valuable only for facilitating their transformation plans, not for questioning whether those plans addressed the right problems. The final afternoon dissolved into evening with the melancholic beauty of endings that feel both earned and stolen. Evelyn cleaned the coffee machine for the last time, wiped down counters that had absorbed decades of conversations, and collected personal items that seemed pitifully small compared to the years of labor they represented. Her notebook, filled with observations and analyses that had never been valued in any marketplace, felt heavier than all her other possessions combined. As she walked home through neighborhoods where for sale signs had multiplied like winter weeds, Evelyn carried with her the accumulated weight of invisible expertise that would never be translated into economic security or professional recognition. She understood complex systems and human motivations with a sophistication that surpassed many of the consultants who earned more in a single day than she had made in entire months, yet the credentials that would legitimize her knowledge remained forever beyond her reach. The apartment she shared with Miguel felt smaller that night, as if the loss of her job had also diminished their physical space. Her son, now 14 and more aware of their economic fragility than she wished, asked careful questions about their future while pretending to focus on homework that would determine whether he might escape the economic constraints that held her captive. She answered with the practiced optimism of someone who had learned to protect others from her own fear, even as she calculated mentally how long their savings would last and what choices would need to be made about rent and food and Miguel's educational opportunities. The silence that followed her departure from Donna's diner was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something heavier. The accumulated weight of labor that had been rendered invisible, of intelligence that had been systematically devalued, of dignity that had been worn thin through years of economic humiliation. In the space where her work had existed, there was now only the echo of efficiency optimization, the sound of profit margins being maximized while community relationships were dissolved. She had been disappeared not through any personal failing, but through the mechanical operation of economic forces that treated human beings as interchangeable units of labor, valuable only insofar as they contributed to shareholder returns. The same systems that had allowed Maxwell Grant to accumulate billions while remaining ignorant of the expertise possessed by the people who served him had now eliminated her position in favor of algorithmic solutions that could deliver food without the messy complications of human connection. That night, as Chicago settled into winter darkness and the towers of downtown glittered with the wealth generated by such systematic elimination of expensive human labor, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with her notebook open, writing analysis of her own economic displacement with the same careful precision she had once applied to understanding other people's business problems. She was documenting the destruction of her own livelihood with the intellectual honesty of someone who understood that her personal catastrophe was merely a small part of larger structural changes that were reshaping American work in favor of capital over community. The silence that followed Evelyn's departure from Donna's diner settled over the renovated space like dust after demolition, invisible but pervasive, changing the very chemistry of air and interaction. The corporate efficiency experts had transformed the familiar red vinyl booths into sleek modular seating, replaced the handwritten menu boards with digital displays that cycled through algorithmic recommendations, and installed touchscreen ordering kiosks that eliminated the need for customers to speak with human servers. What they had not anticipated was how these improvements would strip away the invisible social infrastructure that had made the diner profitable in the first place. Within 6 weeks of reopening, customer complaints flooded corporate headquarters as breakfast regulars discovered that their usual orders were no longer remembered. Their preferences had been deleted along with the staff who had maintained them in human memory rather than computer databases. The new part-time workers, trained through online modules rather than mentorship from experienced servers, made mistakes that had never occurred when Evelyn and her colleagues had applied years of accumulated knowledge to anticipating customer needs. Maxwell Grant, meanwhile, was discovering that his restaurant acquisition strategy was generating losses that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections from his business analysts. The consultants he had hired to optimize operations had eliminated exactly the human elements that created customer loyalty, replacing experienced judgment with algorithmic decision-making that proved incapable of reading social cues or adapting to the subtle variations that made service businesses successful. His cryptocurrency investments were also performing poorly, victim to market volatility that his trading algorithms had failed to predict, while his real estate portfolio faced unexpected pressures from changing neighborhood dynamics that his data analysts had not factored into their models. For the first time in his career, Maxwell Grant was experiencing the disorienting reality of systematic failure, watching his diversified wealth shrink despite following advice from experts with impeccable credentials and proven track records. The turning point came during a late-night review session in his penthouse office, high above the Chicago streets where people like Evelyn navigated economic uncertainty with the kind of strategic thinking that his business school education had never addressed. Maxwell was reviewing quarterly loss reports when his assistant mentioned finding an old analysis in his files, an anonymous consultant's report that had accurately predicted every failure his restaurant chain was now experiencing. He read Evelyn's analysis with the growing amazement of someone discovering a map to territory he had been wandering through blindly. Every prediction had materialized exactly as she had calculated. Every recommendation he had ignored would have prevented disasters that were now costing him millions of dollars. The mathematical models were sophisticated beyond anything his paid consultants had produced, while the insights into human psychology demonstrated understanding of customer behavior that surpassed market research, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The report was unsigned, but Maxwell found himself studying its pages with the intensity of someone decoding a message from a superior intelligence, trying to identify the mind capable of such precise analysis. The writing style was clear and accessible, yet technically sophisticated, suggesting someone with both practical experience and theoretical knowledge, comfortable with complex financial concepts, but grounded in operational realities that most business analysts never encountered. As he traced through the logical progression of Evelyn's arguments, Maxwell began to recognize the profound arrogance of his own assumptions about intelligence and expertise. He had dismissed entire categories of human knowledge because they came from people without formal credentials, while accepting advice from credentialed experts whose understanding proved inferior to insights developed through direct experience and careful observation. The search for the report's author became an obsession that pulled Maxwell away from his usual social circles and into investigation of the communities his business decisions had affected. He visited the restaurants he had acquired, speaking with former employees who had been displaced by his optimization strategies, gradually assembling a picture of the expertise he had discarded in favor of algorithmic efficiency. The stories he heard from former staff members revealed levels of business intelligence that his corporate training had taught him to overlook, insights into customer psychology and operational efficiency developed through years of frontline experience. The trail eventually led him back to Donna's Diner, now operating as Metro Express Food Solutions, with digital ordering and minimal staff. The original building remained, but its social function had been completely transformed, converted from a community gathering place into a distribution point for mass-produced meals, optimized for speed rather than satisfaction. Former customers spoke nostalgically about servers who had remembered their names and preferences, who had provided informal counseling during difficult times, who had created the kind of social capital that could not be replaced by touchscreen technology. It was Rosa, the former cook now working at a taco truck in Pilsen, who finally identified the anonymous analyst as Evelyn Martinez. She described Evelyn's habit of filling notebooks with financial observations, her ability to predict customer needs and operational problems, her intelligence that had been consistently undervalued by customers who assumed that serving food required no mental skills. Rosa also provided Evelyn's current address, mentioning that she was struggling to find employment that utilized her abilities while providing income sufficient to support her son's educational goals. Maxwell Grant's recognition of his own blindness was both humbling and terrifying, forcing him to confront how much valuable insight he had dismissed through prejudices that confused class markers with competence. The woman he had humiliated for serving imperfect coffee possessed exactly the business intelligence his companies needed to avoid catastrophic mistakes, while he had been paying consultants enormous fees for advice that proved inferior to knowledge developed through careful observation and necessity-driven analysis. The distance between his penthouse office and Evelyn's apartment in Pilsen was measured not only in miles, but in assumptions about where valuable knowledge could be found, who possessed the right to speak on complex subjects, and what kinds of experience qualified someone to understand sophisticated problems. Maxwell was about to cross boundaries that his wealth and education had taught him were fixed and natural, discovering that intelligence and wisdom were distributed in patterns that bore no relationship to formal credentials or economic position. The reunion occurred on a gray December afternoon, when Chicago's winter light held the thin quality of promises made without conviction, filtering through clouds that seemed to press down on the city like the weight of accumulated mistakes requiring correction. Maxwell Grant had spent 3 days walking through Pilsen, learning the geography of economic displacement, while working up the courage to approach the woman whose intelligence he had dismissed with such casual cruelty months earlier. Evelyn was returning from her 3rd job interview of the week, each one adding another layer to her understanding of how economic barriers were designed to exclude people like her from positions where her knowledge might be valued. The interviewers had been polite but dismissive, focusing on her lack of formal business education rather than the insights she had developed through years of practical experience. She carried her portfolio of analyses in a worn leather folder that had belonged to her late husband, hoping that somewhere in Chicago's vast economy there might be space for intelligence unvalidated by institutional credentials. She found Maxwell Grant standing outside her apartment building like someone who had lost his way in more than just physical terms, his expensive coat incongruous against the backdrop of a neighborhood where such displays of wealth were rare and often resented. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by what she would later understand was genuine humility, born from recognizing the magnitude of his own ignorance. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, her name carrying weight that acknowledged her personhood in ways their previous encounter had not. "I was hoping we could speak. I owe you an apology, and perhaps something more substantial than words." Evelyn studied his face with the careful attention she had learned to apply when reading customers' moods and motivations, noting the sincerity that had replaced his previous contempt, but remaining alert to the possibility that this was another exercise in wealthy guilt that would evaporate once his conscience was soothed. She had seen other versions of this scene, powerful people discovering temporary compassion that lasted only until their own comfort was restored. "What do you want, Mr. Grant?" she asked, her voice carrying the directness of someone who could not afford to waste time on social pleasantries that might disguise economic manipulation. Maxwell reached into his briefcase and withdrew the report she had written, its pages now marked with highlighter and annotation that showed how carefully he had studied her analysis. "You wrote this," he said. It was not a question. "Your predictions were completely accurate. Your recommendations would have saved my company millions of dollars and preserved hundreds of jobs. I ignored it because I didn't know it came from you, and I didn't know you because I had decided that someone in your position couldn't possess this kind of expertise." The admission hung between them like winter air made visible, crystallizing assumptions that had shaped both their lives in ways neither had fully understood. Evelyn took the report and paged through her own work, remembering the nights she had spent crafting arguments that no one with power to implement them would ever seriously consider. "And now?" she asked, handing the papers back to him. Maxwell Grant's response revealed preparation that went beyond momentary guilt into systematic recognition of his own failures. He had tracked the consequences of his business decisions through communities like hers, had seen how algorithmic optimization destroyed social capital that took generations to build, had discovered that the expertise he needed to make informed decisions existed primarily among people whose knowledge had been systematically devalued by educational and economic structures designed to protect existing hierarchies. "Now I want to offer you a position as a strategic consultant for my investment group," he said, "not as charity, but because you understand aspects of business that I've been paying other consultants enormous amounts to analyze incorrectly. Your insights are worth far more than the salaries I've been paying people with advanced degrees who couldn't see what you saw clearly." Evelyn's immediate reaction was suspicion born from years of learning that offers from wealthy people usually came with hidden costs that became apparent only after commitment had been made. She had heard similar promises before, always structured to provide maximum benefit to the powerful while requiring maximum risk from the vulnerable. Yet, something in Maxwell's presentation suggested awareness of these dynamics, recognition that genuine partnership required acknowledging rather than ignoring the power imbalances that shaped their interaction. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, settling into the negotiating mindset that had helped her survive years of economic precarity while maintaining her dignity. The package Maxwell outlined was comprehensive, addressing not only immediate employment, but longer-term concerns about economic security and professional development. A consulting salary that exceeded what she could earn through service work, health insurance that included her son, educational support that would allow her to pursue formal business training while working, and equity participation that would give her meaningful share in the success of investments she helped guide. More importantly, he proposed structural changes to his decision-making process that would incorporate perspectives from workers and communities affected by his investments, creating systematic consultation with people whose expertise came from direct experience rather than academic study. It was recognition that valuable knowledge existed throughout economic hierarchies, not just at the levels where wealth and education concentrated. The conversation continued for 2 hours as they walked through her neighborhood, Evelyn pointing out examples of the economic dynamics she had analyzed in her reports, while Maxwell began to understand how abstract financial decisions created concrete consequences in real people's lives. She showed him corner stores driven out of business by chain competition, apartment buildings where rent increases had displaced longtime residents, community institutions that had closed when neighborhood gentrification changed their customer base. What emerged was not just an employment opportunity, but a collaboration between different types of expertise, theoretical knowledge informed by practical experience, strategic thinking grounded in understanding of implementation challenges. Their partnership would require Maxwell to question assumptions that his wealth and education had taught him were natural facts, while offering Evelyn recognition and resources that could translate her intelligence into broader influence. As afternoon light faded over the city, they were both learning to see more clearly. Evelyn made her decision with the same careful calculation she applied to all major choices, weighing potential benefits against possible costs, while understanding that meaningful change required accepting carefully calculated risks. She would work with Maxwell Grant, not as supplicant grateful for rescue, but as equal partner bringing essential expertise to challenges that required intelligence drawn from multiple sources. Their handshake sealed more than a business agreement. It represented acknowledgement that competence and wisdom were distributed throughout society in patterns that bore no relationship to formal credentials, and that solving complex problems required listening to voices that traditional power structures had been designed to silence. The redemption unfolded not as sudden transformation, but as systematic recognition of value that had always existed, but had been rendered invisible by structures designed to concentrate wisdom among those who possessed wealth rather than those who possessed knowledge. Maxwell Grant's investment group underwent reorganization that incorporated Evelyn's analytical approach throughout its decision-making processes, creating formal consultation mechanisms with communities and workers affected by their strategic choices. Evelyn's first project involved analyzing Maxwell's remaining restaurant acquisitions, developing strategies that preserved the social capital that made these businesses valuable while improving their financial sustainability. Her recommendations balanced efficiency improvements with recognition that restaurants succeeded by creating community gathering places, not merely by optimizing food delivery systems. The implementation of her strategies resulted in increased profitability alongside improved working conditions, demonstrating that choices between social responsibility and financial success were often false dilemmas created by narrow analytical frameworks. Within 6 months, Maxwell's restaurant chain had become a model for sustainable business practices that generated superior returns by investing in employee expertise and community relationships rather than eliminating them. Evelyn's insights were proven through results that exceeded the projections of traditional business analysts, while her methods were studied by other investment groups seeking to understand how social intelligence could be incorporated into financial analysis. Her success in the business world was paralleled by personal recognition within her community, where she became a symbol of possibilities that existed when intelligence was valued regardless of its institutional credentials. She spoke at community colleges and workforce development programs, sharing analysis techniques that could be applied by anyone willing to observe carefully and think systematically about economic relationships. Her message was not that education was unimportant, but that learning happened in multiple contexts and that valuable expertise existed in communities where formal institutions had failed to recognize it. Miguel's educational opportunities expanded as Evelyn's consulting fees provided resources that had been unimaginable during their years of economic struggle. But more importantly, he witnessed his mother's transition from invisible service worker to recognized expert, understanding through example that intelligence and determination could overcome structural barriers, though not without significant effort and strategic thinking. He saw that change required not just individual achievement, but systematic recognition of competence wherever it existed. The diner that had once employed Evelyn was eventually purchased by her newly formed Community Development Corporation, a joint venture with Maxwell's investment group that specialized in preserving neighborhood institutions while improving their economic sustainability. The renovated space honored both efficiency and community function, incorporating modern systems while maintaining the social capital that had made it a gathering place for multiple generations of working-class families. Rosa returned as head cook, Janet resumed her role as server, and together they trained new staff members in service approaches that balanced productivity with community building. The diner became a model for how food service businesses could provide good jobs while serving their neighborhoods, demonstrating that social responsibility and profitability were compatible when business strategies incorporated understanding of human relationships alongside financial optimization. Evelyn's analytical methods were eventually codified into consulting practices that could be applied beyond restaurant businesses, addressing infrastructure investments, housing policy, and economic development strategies that affected working communities. Her approach emphasized incorporating insights from people directly affected by decisions, recognizing that implementation success required understanding social dynamics that were invisible from executive offices and academic institutions. The partnership between Maxwell and Evelyn evolved into systematic collaboration that combined different types of expertise without hierarchical assumptions about which knowledge was more valuable. Their joint consulting firm specialized in investments that generated sustainable returns by strengthening rather than extracting from communities, proving that financial success was compatible with social development when strategies were designed by people who understood both economic principles and community dynamics. Recognition of Evelyn's expertise spread throughout Chicago's business community, as her predictions consistently proved more accurate than analysis provided by traditional consulting firms, while her implementation strategies generated superior results with lower social costs. She was invited to speak at business schools and professional conferences, sharing insights about how class barriers prevented valuable knowledge from informing important decisions. Her presentations challenged audiences to question assumptions about where intelligent analysis originated, demonstrating that the service workers they ignored possessed sophisticated understanding of consumer psychology, operational efficiency, and social dynamics that were essential for business success. She argued that economic inequality was maintained partly through systematic dismissal of expertise held by people without formal credentials, and that more effective decision-making required incorporating insights from throughout social hierarchies. As Chicago's winter softened toward spring, Evelyn often walked through the neighborhoods where she had once struggled to make rent, noting improvements that resulted from investment strategies guided by community input rather than imposed from distant offices. The changes were subtle but significant, local businesses thriving because they received capital along with technical assistance, housing developments that preserved affordability while improving quality, infrastructure improvements, designed through consultation with residents who would live with their consequences. The transformation was not complete or universal, but it demonstrated that alternatives to extractive capitalism were possible when business decisions incorporated wisdom from multiple sources rather than concentrating authority among those who possessed wealth but lacked understanding of implementation realities. Evelyn's success proved that intelligence was distributed throughout society in patterns that bore no relationship to formal education, and that solving complex problems required listening to voices that traditional power structures had been designed to silence. Her story became part of Chicago's business school curricula, studied as an example of how prejudice prevented valuable knowledge from informing important decisions, and how systematic inclusion of diverse perspectives improved both social outcomes and financial returns. Students learned to recognize expertise regardless of its institutional validation, understanding that competence was demonstrated through results rather than credentials. The years that followed brought continued success as Evelyn's analytical approach was applied to increasingly complex challenges. From urban planning projects that required understanding community dynamics to international investments that needed insight into local social structures. Her methods proved applicable across cultures and economic systems, demonstrating that careful observation and systematic thinking could generate valuable insights regardless of formal educational backgrounds. Yet, success had not erased the emotional scars of years spent invisible, dismissed, and humiliated by a system that confused institutional credentials with human worth. Late at night, when Chicago slept beneath stars obscured by the glow of wealth concentrated in towers, she now entered as equal rather than servant. Evelyn would sometimes sit with her old notebook, reading observations written when her intelligence had no market value, when her insights carried weight only in margins of receipt books and quiet moments between coffee refills. The transformation had been profound, but it had also illuminated how much potential was routinely wasted when economies valued credentials over competence, when intelligence was dismissed because it came from people whose life circumstances had prevented them from acquiring formal validation of abilities that were demonstrated daily through sophisticated problem-solving applied to survival itself. In conference rooms where her analysis now guided decisions affecting millions of dollars and thousands of jobs, Evelyn often thought about Rosa still cooking at dawn, about Janet still carrying plates while memorizing customer preferences, about countless others whose minds held solutions to problems that would never be recognized, because those minds belonged to bodies dressed in uniforms rather than business suits. The partnership with Maxwell had changed her individual circumstances, but it had also revealed the vast reservoir of unused intelligence that remained trapped by economic structures designed to extract labor while discarding the wisdom of those who performed it. Her work had become not just about business success, but about systematic recognition that expertise existed everywhere, that solutions to complex problems required incorporating insights from people closest to implementation challenges, and that sustainable prosperity demanded honoring intelligence regardless of its social presentation. She had moved from serving coffee to serving on corporate boards, but the fundamental insight remained the same. That valuable knowledge developed wherever careful minds engaged seriously with challenging problems, regardless of whether those minds possessed degrees or sat behind executive desks. The revolution had begun with one woman's notebook filled with observations that no one valued, insights developed through necessity and honed through invisible labor. It continued through recognition that intelligence was society's most broadly distributed resource, and that economic systems capable of recognizing competence wherever it appeared would outperform those that confused class markers with cognitive ability. Evelyn's journey from waitress to strategic consultant had proven that minds capable of sophisticated analysis existed throughout every economic stratum, waiting for opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that had always been present but rarely acknowledged. And now, as Miguel prepared for his freshman year at Northwestern University, studying business with scholarships earned through academic excellence that his mother's example had taught him was possible regardless of economic origin, Evelyn understood that individual success meant nothing unless it created pathways for others to demonstrate their own unrecognized capabilities. The notebook she had carried through years of invisibility had become the foundation for systematic changes in how intelligence was identified and valued, proving that the most sophisticated analysis often came from minds that had learned to solve problems with limited resources, who understood efficiency not as abstract concept, but as daily survival requirement. The city lights reflected off Lake Michigan as Evelyn stood in the penthouse office she now shared as equal partner with Maxwell Grant, looking down at streets where millions of people possessed insights that could revolutionize industries if anyone had the wisdom to listen. Her journey had demonstrated that intelligence was not scarce, but that recognition of intelligence was artificially limited by prejudices that served no productive purpose beyond maintaining hierarchies that wasted human potential on an enormous scale. The woman who had once wiped counters while calculating market trends in her head had become living proof that expertise developed wherever minds engaged seriously with challenging problems, regardless of the economic circumstances that shaped those challenges. The story that began with morning light filtering through grimy diner windows had evolved into systematic recognition that wisdom existed everywhere, waiting for societies sophisticated enough to value competence over credentials, insight over institutional approval, and intelligence over all the arbitrary barriers that had been constructed to limit recognition of human potential to narrow channels that served existing power structures rather than broader human flourishing. And have you ever possessed knowledge that others dismissed because of assumptions about your background or position? Have you watched decisions being made by people who lacked understanding of their consequences, while knowing that your insights could have prevented costly mistakes? Have you learned to see patterns in relationships that others missed, only to find that your observations were ignored because they came from someone in a service position? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moments when your intelligence was overlooked, when your expertise was dismissed, when you knew better solutions but lacked the platform to present them. If Evelyn's journey from invisible server to recognized expert touched something in your experience, leave a like and subscribe so this story reaches other people who deserve to have their knowledge valued and their insights heard. Your intelligence and wisdom matter, regardless of where you developed them or how others have chosen to recognize them. The problems facing our communities and businesses need solutions that can only be developed by incorporating insights from throughout society, including especially the perspectives of those who have been closest to implementation realities. For more stories about hidden expertise and unexpected wisdom, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for sharing this emotional journey through systematic recognition of value that already existed but had been rendered invisible. See you in the next story, where we will continue exploring how intelligence and dignity can overcome institutional barriers when supported by recognition and opportunity.